Y vamos a dar comienzo a esta jornada de encuentro con el filósofo de Oxford, Richard Swinburne. Bienvenidos a todos a esta facultad, sobre todo a quienes venís de lejos, venís de fuera, y esperamos que tengamos también una jornada enriquecedora y que tengamos también un buen día de pensamiento y de discusión. Para quienes no me conocéis, yo soy Ricardo de Luis, soy el director de la editorial San Esteban, y es la editorial en la que se han publicado pues, dos de las obras de Richard Swinburne. Con nosotros está también, y le agradezco todas las facilidades que nos ha dado, don Miguel Ayuso, el director de la editorial Sígueme, en donde se ha traducido también otra obra de él, Hay un Dios, que ha aparecido creo que hace una semana, está reciente. Pues muchas gracias, Miguel, por organizar el encuentro y también por todas las facilidades que nos habéis dado. Y muchas gracias también a todos ustedes, al profesor Miguel García Baró, que junto con Sisto Castro pues son los traductores al español de las obras de Richard Swinburne. Vamos a dar comienzo a esta jornada. Me parece que en el programa y en la publicidad que hicimos de este día ofrecíamos también un horario que, como suele ser en estos encuentros, es aproximado y todo pues va a depender del desarrollo que vayamos teniendo. Vamos a comenzar con una conferencia en donde el profesor nos va a explicar lo que son sobre todo las bases de su pensamiento y las bases de su propuesta. Después, en la segunda parte de la mañana y después de un descanso, tendremos un rato de discusión con él, y por la tarde a las 4:30 haremos una presentación de lo que son sus tres obras que están traducidas al castellano, del planteamiento que ahí se hace y de lo que él pretende, y para concluir también en torno a las 6 de la tarde, después de una discusión respecto al contenido de esos libros. A mi derecha se encuentra el profesor Sisto José Castro, que es profesor de Estética y de Filosofía de la Religión en la Facultad de Filosofía de la Universidad de Valladolid. Ha sido el traductor de dos de las obras del profesor Richard Swinburne, La existencia de Dios y Fe y Razón. Acaba también de publicar una obra dedicada al pensamiento de filosofía de la religión en la corriente analítica de filosofía, lógica de la creencia, y le agradecemos también pues todos los esfuerzos que ha hecho por organizar este acto. Él es el responsable, yo creo, último de que Richard Swinburne esté hoy aquí con nosotros, y le vamos a dar la palabra para que brevemente nos haga también una presentación y una semblanza de lo que es la obra de este filósofo.
Gracias, Ricardo. Bueno, yo no voy a decir mucho de Richard Swinburne porque él va a hablar de sí mismo. Va a hablar de sí mismo porque va a hablar de su obra. Yo simplemente quiero agradecer al profesor Swinburne por haber venido, haberlo hecho desde el principio, ha acogido esta iniciativa con sumo interés, con sumo agrado, y tanto a él como a las dos editoriales, San Esteban y a Sígueme, pues como hará, me consta, porque he traducido también la conferencia, el profesor Swinburne, agradecerles que se hayan metido en esta tarea tan intempestiva, traducir unos textos de filosofía de la religión cuando, bueno, esperemos que sea el momento. Aquí tenemos, por ejemplo, a Enrique Romerales, que es quien probablemente sea el que introdujo esta forma de pensamiento en España hace muchos años, pero que en su momento no tuvo excesivo eco. No sé si en este momento lo tendrá, espero que sea así. Y bueno, para eso contamos con estas nuevas traducciones que creo que pueden servir en este camino, ¿no? Bueno, pues Richard Swinburne es profesor emérito de Filosofía de la Religión Cristiana de la Universidad de Oxford. Y es una universidad a la que he estado vinculado desde que empezó a estudiar allá en el año 1952. Como él no habla en castellano, es probable que yo meta alguna gamba y no se va a dar cuenta. Si es "You don't speak Spanish, maybe I make a mistake", but... Y en ella ha sido profesor desde el año 85. Y profesor de Oxford y profesor visitante en innumerables universidades de todo el mundo, ¿no? Bueno, entre sus obras destacan, y sin traducir, pues Espacio y Tiempo, el concepto de milagro. Estas ya son del 68, Espacio y Tiempo, el concepto de milagro, una introducción a la teoría de la confirmación, y la coherencia del teísmo, que quizá fue la primera obra analítica, ayer lo comentábamos, que se introdujo en el ámbito de la primera obra sobre filosofía de la religión que supuso una especie de hito en el ámbito de la filosofía analítica, y que está pendiente, me contaba ahora, de una nueva edición, porque desde que la publicó en el año 77 pues ha llovido mucho, las cosas han cambiado mucho y está pendiente de una nueva edición que puede ser casi una nueva obra. Sobre esto tenemos ya del año 79 la existencia de Dios, que es la que hemos traducido aquí, el año 79 con una reedición en el 91 y con otra en el 2004, y en cada una de ellas pues han ido introduciendo novedades. Fe y razón, que es otra de las obras que hemos traducido aquí, cuya primera edición es del 81 y la segunda del 2005. Tenemos la evolución del alma, responsabilidad y expiación, revelación, el Dios cristiano del 94, providencia y el problema del mal del 98, hay un Dios, que es la otra obra que está aquí traducida, cuya primera edición es del 96 y la segunda del 2010, la justificación epistémica, y luego otras que son la resurrección del Dios encarnado y fue Jesús o era Jesús Dios. Tres de estas obras, la coherencia del teísmo, fe y razón y la existencia de Dios, forman una trilogía de lo que podría ser la filosofía del teísmo, una especie de teología natural en sentido amplio. Y luego otras tres obras que son responsabilidad y expiación, revelación, el Dios cristiano y la providencia y el problema del mal, forman una tetralogía sobre lo que sería la filosofía de la doctrina cristiana, es decir, ya la teología natural ramificada, como él la llama, propiamente del cristianismo. Además de esto, ha editado varios libros, publicado, cuando preparé esto, más de 100 artículos, que seguro que ahora serán más de 100, pero a lo mejor son más de 200, ya no lo sé, sobre filosofía de la ciencia, teoría de la confirmación, probabilidad, y especialmente sobre los grandes temas que constituyen la filosofía de la religión. Todo esto le ha convertido en una de las figuras más importantes de la filosofía de la religión actual. De hecho, en cualquier texto de filosofía de la religión o en cualquier texto que sea opuesto a la filosofía de la religión, de esos que están tan de moda ahora, pues él sale citado. ¿A favor o en contra? Bueno, no voy a hablar mucho sobre su pensamiento, porque él va a hablar ahora, ¿no? Simplemente tiene una cierta peculiaridad y es, en cierto modo, dejar ciertos argumentos o ciertos modos de argumentar tradicionales de lado e introducir nuevos modos de argumentar que, en cierto modo, no alcanzan una certeza total, ni lo pretenden, pero de algún modo ofrecen como una especie de propuesta, vamos a decir así, bastante razonable. Podríamos decir que sus grandes ideas es que la idea del Dios que defiende el teísmo es una idea coherente, no es una idea, digamos, que sea, digamos, no es una idea incoherente, es una idea que en cierto modo se puede someter a argumentos y que los argumentos son necesarios, él defiende, y él cree que la creencia es y debe ser racional, es otro de los grandes temas de Hegel. Bueno, como decía antes, pues es un autor que ha sido muy alabado y al mismo tiempo muy criticado, por razones muy diversas y desde frentes muy diferentes. Yo creo que eso no es un signo de debilidad, al contrario, creo que es un signo de fortaleza. Cuando uno entra con esta fuerza en el panorama filosófico, pues parece que su teoría es lo suficientemente seria como para provocar todo tipo de reacciones. Ahora le queda al lector la tarea de evaluar esta ingente tarea, pues o bien acudiendo a las obras originales, o ya que estamos aquí, pues acudiendo a estas traducciones que nos han quedado tan bonitas. Y sobre las cuales, digamos, algunas, pues no... me decía ayer el profesor Swinburne que algunas de estas obras, por ejemplo, la existencia de Dios, ahora se traduce al alemán, al francés, y ya incorpora las correcciones que hemos encontrado los traductores, que el trabajo de traductor también tiene su aquel. Y ya sin más, pues le cedo la palabra al profesor Richard Swinburne y le agradezco profundamente que esté aquí. I really appreciate your stay here. So, yes.
Thank you for all coming, and thank you for listening to me in English. I apologize for you having to listen to an English lecture, but I do hope all of you will have the text of the Spanish in front of you. Does anyone not have a text of the Spanish who wants one?
Todo el mundo tiene el texto, la traducción española, todo el mundo que lo necesite. ¿Alguien que lo necesite y no lo tenga?
Ahora se lo facilito.
Ok. We'll bring some copies. I think we can start. Yeah. Yeah. Just go on.
I'm most grateful to Dr. Sixto Castro for translating my two books, The Existence of God and Faith and Reason, and to Dr. Martin Baró for translating the shorter version of the first book, Is There a God, into Spanish. And I'm most grateful to San Esteban and to Sigme for taking the considerable financial risk involved in publishing these translations. You've all paid me a considerable compliment, and I am most grateful. The Existence of God, the book, of which Is There a God, book, is a shorter and simpler version, is a natural theology. It argues from the most general features of the universe, that there is a physical universe that is governed by simple and comprehensible laws of nature. These laws and the initial conditions of the universe are such as to bring about the evolution of human bodies, that humans are conscious, that humans have deep responsibilities for themselves and each other, and that various particular historical events occurred, and that millions of humans have had deep religious experiences. All of these phenomena, my claim is, are best explained by the existence of God, and they make it probable that there is a God. In this lecture, I'm going to do three things. First, I will explain very briefly, the structure of my natural theology. Then, I will explain why I think the arguments of Hume and Kant purporting to show that there cannot be a viable natural theology have no cogency whatever. And then, thirdly, I will consider even more briefly the relevance of natural theology to the practice of religion. This final topic is the topic of my book, Faith and Reason. Natural theology has been part of the Christian intellectual tradition for most of its life, and it has roots both in the Old Testament and in Greek philosophy. The prophet Jeremiah argued to the power of the Creator from the extent of the creation. I quote, "The host of heaven cannot be numbered, neither the sea of the sand be measured." And Jeremiah argued to the reliability of the Creator from the regular behavior of the creation. He spoke of the covenant of night and day, whereby day and night follow each other regularly, and, quote, "the ordinances of heaven and earth show that the being in charge of the universe is a trustworthy one." In his letter to the Romans, St. Paul claimed that, quote, "ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things he has made." Many theologians of the first millennium gave brief, unformalized arguments, and many philosophers from the 12th to the 18th centuries gave long, deductive, formalized arguments from the world and its order to the existence of God. Those who offered deductive arguments were claiming that the various features of the natural world entail that there is a God, so that it would entail a contradiction to assert both that these general features occur and that there is no God. But deductive arguments only bring out what you are already committed to by the premises, and I think that the occurrence of such finite features as are described by the typical premises of a natural theology argument could not possibly entail the occurrence of an infinite God. That is to say, it wouldn't be a contradiction to say the world has these characteristics, but there is no God. So there couldn't be a deductive argument. But inductive or probabilistic arguments can proceed from limited premises to much bigger conclusions. I think, therefore, that the most satisfactory form of a natural theology is likely to be inductive, and so I have tried to present an inductive natural theology. And here, very briefly, it is. All arguments in science and history, from particular data to hypotheses which explain them, are inductive. I suggest that an argument from observed phenomena E to an explanatory cause H is cogent, that is, renders its conclusion that H is probably true, insofar as one, and this is in your text, insofar as one, if H is true, it's probable that E will occur. If H is false, it's improbable that E will occur. And 3, H is simple. Here is an imaginary historical type example of how these criteria work. A detective finds various clues, John being seen near the scene of a burglary at the time when it was committed, John's fingerprints being on a burgled safe, and John having the stolen money hidden in his house. And then, the detective claims, these clues make it very probable that John robbed the safe. We'd agree, they make it probable. Why do they make it probable? This is because, one, if John did rob the safe, it's quite probable that he would be seen near the burglary time at the time the burglary was committed. It would be quite probable that his fingerprints would be on the safe, and it would be quite probable that money stolen would be found in his house. That's one. It satisfies the first criterion. Two, if John did not rob the safe, it would not be probable that he would be seen near the scene of the burglary, and very improbable that his fingerprints would be found on the safe and the money be found in his house. Second criterion. And thirdly, the hypothesis that John robbed the safe is much simpler than rival hypotheses which would satisfy the first two criteria. John's defense lawyer could always suggest other possible explanations of the clues. The defense lawyer could suggest that Brown planted John's fingerprints on the safe, Smith dressed up to look like John at the scene of the crime, and without any collusion with the others, Robinson hid the money in John's flat. This new hypothesis would lead us to expect the three clues just as well as does the hypothesis that John robbed the safe, which satisfy the first two criteria equally well. But the latter hypothesis, the hypothesis that John robbed the safe, is confirmed by the evidence, whereas the former is not. This is because the hypothesis that John robbed the safe is far simpler than this rival hypothesis. A hypothesis is simple insofar as it postulates the existence and operation of few entities, few kinds of entities, with few easily describable properties behaving in mathematically simple kinds of ways. The detective's hypothesis postulates one entity, John, doing one deed, robbing the safe, which leads us to expect the several phenomena which we find, whereas the defense lawyer's rival hypothesis postulates three separate individuals acting without any coordination between them. So there's a detective example. Now, physical scientists use this same pattern of explanation to argue to the existence of unobservable entities as causes of the phenomena which they observe. To take a real example this time, at the beginning of the 19th century, scientists observed many varied phenomena of chemical interaction, such as that substances combine in fixed ratios by weight to form new substances. For example, hydrogen and oxygen always form water in a ratio of weight by 1 to 8. Scientists then claimed that these phenomena would be expected if there existed 100 or so different kinds of atoms, particles too small to be seen, which combine and recombine in certain simple ways. In their turn, physicists postulated electrons, protons, neutrons, and other particles in order to account for the behavior of the atoms, as well as for larger scale observable phenomena. And now physicists postulate quarks in order to explain the behavior of protons, neutrons, and other particles. What they postulated makes probable the occurrence of the phenomena. The occurrence of the phenomena is otherwise not probable, and the hypotheses are simpler than rival explanations thereof because it involves the operation of far fewer kinds of entities behaving in mathematically simple ways than would rival hypotheses. So there's two examples of how these criteria work. That is to say, how a hypothesis postulating an explanation is made probable by observable data. My arguments from the general features of the universe to the existence of God exhibit the same pattern of argument. The most general of the phenomena requiring explanation are first the phenomenon of the very existence of a physical universe, and secondly, the conformity of all physical objects to laws of nature, which I understand as the phenomenon that all physical objects behave in exactly the same simple way. For example, the law of gravity just is the phenomenon that all atoms attract all other atoms in accord with the same simple formula. And then thirdly, there is the phenomenon that these laws are such as to lead to the evolution of human bodies. And fourthly, the phenomenon that human beings are conscious. So there's four phenomena to be explained. To be a person, a substance has to live for a period of time. To be a person like us, we have to live for a period of time, to have some power, for example, to move my body, some true beliefs, and some freedom to choose how to exercise this power. God is the simplest kind of person there could be, since there are zero limits, no limits to the length of his life, his power, his true beliefs, and to his freedom of choice. He is, that is, everlasting, omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly free. Other things being equal, scientists prefer hypotheses postulating infinite degrees of properties as simpler than hypotheses postulating large finite degrees of properties. Omnipotence is the ability to do anything logically possible. Omniscience entails knowledge of which actions are good. And perfect freedom involves freedom from influences determining the agent, from influences determining the agent. Involves freedom from influences which deter the agent. I'm sorry, the text is deter the agent from doing what he sees to be good. The good motivates. Insofar as you recognize an action as good and can do it, you will do it, unless subject to irrational influences. God, being perfectly free, is subject to no such influences, and so he will bring about what is good. It is not logically possible for him to bring about everything good, for whatever good universe he makes, a bigger one would be better. But humans have a unique kind of goodness, not possessed even by God, the ability to choose between good and evil, combined with an ability by our choices to hurt or benefit each other in significant ways, and therefore form our own characters for good or ill. So it's quite probable that God will bring about us, and so therefore the necessary conditions for our existence, an orderly universe in which our actions have practical effects, human bodies and human conscious lives. But it is immensely improbable that there would be such a universe unless an agent made it. And God is just one agent, and by far the simplest such agent. So the general nature of the universe makes it probable that there is a God. That, in very brief outline, is the structure of my natural theology. It is contained more fully in there, and even more fully in the existence of God. Okay, just repeat very, very briefly. We've got these phenomena. There's a physical universe governed by simple laws. That is to say, every atom, every quark behaves in exactly the same simple way. That same simple way is such as to lead to the evolution of human bodies. These bodies are the bodies of conscious beings. If there is a God, he has reason for bringing these things about, because we're a good thing. We have choices between good and evil, and no other creature does that, and we can make a difference to the world, a more important difference, by our choices. So it's quite probable a God would bring that about if he's perfectly good. The simplest kind of person there would be a being to whose power, knowledge, and freedom there are no limits. If he is omniscient, if there are no limits to his knowledge, he will know what is good. If there are no limits to his freedom, then he will not be subject to influences which deter him from doing the good. The good motivates, therefore he will produce the good. We are a good thing. So we have reason to expect these things. But there is no other, couldn't be an explanation of these things in scientific terms, because the data is science. It is its great success. But its great success just is the fact that every atom behaves in the same way. So either that's the brute fact, or there's another explanation. And the other explanation has this different fact. That is my natural theology. Now, this whole tradition of natural theology, deductive and inductive, became discredited among philosophers as a result of the similar arguments produced by humankind about the bounds to what humans could understand and know. Kant's arguments have had an enormous influence for the past 2 centuries on the thinking of philosophers on the continent of Europe, and via these philosophers on theologians in English-speaking countries as well as on the continent of Europe. Hume's arguments have their greatest influence on the thinking of English-speaking philosophers. I shall now argue that the arguments of both philosophers about the limits to human understanding and knowledge are totally unsound, and provide no good reason why natural theology should not presume its proper place in the Christian and more generally the philosophical tradition. Hume's very general principle about the bounds of intelligibility is that, I quote, all our ideas are compounded of simple ideas, and all simple ideas are derived from impressions. By impressions, Hume means all our more, I quote, all our more lively perceptions, that is, conscious events, when we hear or see or feel or love or hate or desire or will, while by ideas, Hume means, quote, the less lively perceptions of which we are conscious when we reflect on any of those situations or perceptions above mentioned. The ideas produced by impressions can be analyzed as composed of simple ideas. We can compose our simple ideas in various ways so as to form complex ideas of things of which we do not have any impression. Thus, to use Hume's own example, we might have an impression of gold and an impression of a mountain. In other words, we see a lump of gold and we see a mountain. And so we get an idea of gold. We come to understand what gold is and to understand what a mountain is. And then we combine these simple ideas to form the idea of a golden mountain, of which we have not had an impression. So a complex idea formed of simple ideas derived from simple impressions. But, Hume claims, none of us can have any ideas except ones composed of simple ideas ultimately derived from our own impressions. And since Hume assumes humans have impressions only of certain sensible kinds, we can have ideas only of certain kinds. So, I quote, when we entertain any suspicion that a philosophical term is employed without any meaning or idea, as is but too frequent, we need but inquire from what impression is that supposed idea derived, and if no such impression can be produced, writes Hume, that would confirm our suspicion that the term is being employed without any meaning or idea, that is, it's meaningless. Hence, Hume claimed, what we can think is, I quote, it's an important phrase, what we can think is confined within very narrow limits. Hume had a very crude understanding of the nature of thought. It does indeed involve operating with ideas, normally, and especially in the modern world since Kant, called concepts. But concepts are not faint images of perceptions, understood as the conscious events which occur in us when we perceive. Sometimes using a concept of X may be accompanied by having a faint image of X, but that is never sufficient, and seldom, perhaps never necessary. Thinking that inflation is increasing doesn't involve having a faint image of inflation. But despite his crude theory of thinking, Hume was surely correct in the general point he was trying to make, that, as a contingent fact, we think only by means of concepts derived in some sense from our experience of their application to the internal or external world. As the medievals put it, nil in intellectu quod non prius in sensu. But there are two problems with this slogan. One is, to phrase the point in Hume's terms, that our impressions can give rise to many different ideas, some of them applicable only to substances and properties very similar in almost all respects to those which cause the original impression, and other ideas which can be applied to substances and properties very different from those in many respects. Suppose Hume has impressions of what are in fact 18th century European human beings. These impressions can give rise to an idea applicable to and only to 18th century European human beings. But they could also give rise to an idea applicable to and only to humans of any time in culture, and also, even more widely, to an idea applicable to and only to persons, that is, any rational beings, inhabitants of Mars, for example. The problem is, how general are the ideas which we can form from our experience of the world? And the other problem with the Hume slogan is, in what ways is it permissible to combine ideas so as to form other ideas? Can we combine the idea of a person with the idea of a part, and the idea of not having something, and the idea of a material object, so as to give rise to the idea, complex idea, of a person who does not have any material object as a part, that is non-embodied? And could we go further by combining this latter idea with the ideas of power, action, goodness, knowledge, belief, and of a true sentence, all of which are ideas derivable from impressions, to get the idea of a non-embodied person who has the power to do every good action, no power to do an action which is not good, knows all true sentences, and does not believe any sentences which are not true? If so, we are well on the way to having an idea of God. Hume did not face up to these two problems, but whether his slogan, "What we can think is confined within very narrow limits," is true, depends on the solutions to them. However, although Hume has no satisfactory principle for how we can combine ideas in an intelligible way, and although he cannot tell us how general are the simple ideas we can derive from simple impressions, he was, as I have acknowledged, surely right in this, that any simple ideas must be derived from, and so given a meaning by, impressions of actual events. To use a more satisfactory terminology, although we can combine our ideas in various ways, some intelligible and some not, we could only have unanalysable concepts of instances of which we have had experience. For example, the concept of red. To be intelligible, we must have observed red things, and so on. And given only that point, we must pay attention to what Hume had to say about the concept of causation. Because if we were to agree with him about the basis of this concept in human experience, it would indeed follow that talk about God is ultimately unintelligible, or at least totally unknowable. Hume claims that the concept of cause is analysable in terms of constant conjunctions, and that we do have impressions of constant conjunction that is, regular succession. And he claimed on the basis of this principle that since our idea of X causing Y was formed by impressions of objects, that is, events like X, being regularly followed by objects like Y, our concept of cause was therefore itself a concept of regular succession. That is to say, what he meant is that to say that an event X causes an event Y is just to say that for some A and B, X is A, Y is B, and that all A's, or perhaps just most, are followed by B's. To say that X causes Y is to say X is an A, Y is a B, all A's are followed by B's, or possibly most A's are followed by B's. So to say that eating a piece of iron on some occasion caused it to expand is just to say that the succession of events is a regular one. That is, the regularity that all events of heating iron are followed by the expansion of the iron. If that's the right account of causation, then it's natural to suppose that the only way in which we can learn about the cause of a new effect Y, which is a B, is by finding that it is preceded by some event X, which is an A, such that, in our experience, all A's are followed by B's, no B's are not preceded by A's, from which we can conclude that X is the cause of Y. If we wonder what caused some powder to explode, we might find that we must find that it has some property which is such that all things with that property explode. So if we find that the powder is gunpowder, and that in our experience all other pieces of gunpowder explode when ignited, we can justifiably hold that what caused the original expansion was that the power was gunpowder. Okay. Now, God is supposed to be the unobservable cause of the universe, understood, cause of the universe as the cause of all things apart from himself, creating and sustaining them by an act of will. The powers which an omnipotent God is supposed to have are causal powers, powers to cause. So when discussing the suggestion that the universe was caused by God, Hume argues, and I quote, this is Hume, "When two species of objects have always been observed to conjoin together, I can observe by custom the existence of one whenever I see the existence of the other, and this I call an argument from experience. But how this argument can have place where the objects are, as in the present case," that is when God is supposed to cause the universe, "how this argument can have place where the objects, as in the present case, are single, one, individual, without parallel or specific resemblance, may be difficult to explain." End quotation. Hume is arguing that a being could only cause our universe by an act of will if similar beings could cause other universes by their acts of will. And we would have to have observed many acts of will of many gods being followed by the existence of universes before we could conclude that our God caused our universe. But God is supposed to be such that there could not be a being in any way similar to him, and that suggested to Hume that it would make no sense to suppose that he could cause the universe. And even if it were intelligible to suppose that God could cause the universe, since we have never observed other beings causing universes, we could have no knowledge that God caused our universe. So there's Hume's argument. Now, given my earlier point, it does not follow that even if the concept of cause is a concept of regular succession, it doesn't follow that it cannot be meaningfully applied to regular successions of unobservable events. For we could derive from impressions of regular successions of events not merely the idea of one observable event causing another such event, but the more general idea of one event, whether observable or not, causing another event. So we can certainly speculate about states of atoms causing other states of atoms, even if we cannot observe atomic interactions and so reach conclusions about how some atomic events cause other atomic events. But if the concept of causation is a concept of regular succession, it would seem to follow that to suppose there could be singular causation, that is, an object causing some effect even though no similar objects could cause similar effects, would indeed be unintelligible. So if Hume were right, the concept of causation is a concept of regular succession, then indeed natural theology is not possible. Hume was, however, I suggest, mistaken in supposing that our impressions of regular succession are the primary, let alone the only, impressions from which we derive our idea of causation, for we experience ourselves causing events. A basic action, this is a philosophical term much used in Anglo-American philosophy, a basic action is an action which an agent does intentionally, but does not do by doing anything else intentionally. Me making a simple movement, and I moving my hand, is a basic action. I just do it. I don't do it by doing anything else. Of course, certain neural events have to occur in me, but I don't bring them about intentionally. Now, in doing such actions as moving a hand intentionally, I seem to be aware of myself as causing an effect, the motion of my hand. The impression I just get is an unanalyzable impression of me, a person, causing an effect from which I get a simple idea of causing. I don't have any impression of any other mental event in me being followed by some effect. Most basic actions consist in causing independently identifiable effects. There are basic actions which do not consist in causing an effect. Some actions of trying to bring about some bodily movement are basic actions. For example, me trying to move my hand, if it's tied down, would be a basic action, tied down by a rope. Or me trying to lift a heavy weight, even if I don't succeed, it's a basic action, because it's something I do, I mean to try. And what is it for me to try to move my hand? Well, it's to do for whatever it seems to me will make it causally more likely that my hand will move. There is no separate event which I perform and which I can describe in any other way than as doing what it seems to me will make it causally more likely that my hand will move. I couldn't try to move my hand or do any basic action at all unless I believed that I was exerting causal influence, such that if I exerted enough of this causal influence and the external circumstances permitted, for example, if my hand was tied down and the rope would eventually snap, I would cause the intended effect. When I try to make a bodily movement but fail, I do not cause any effect, but the impression which I experience is the impression of exerting causal influence, such as if I exerted enough of it, I would produce an effect. So, both in making some easy bodily movements and in trying to make some difficult bodily movements, I seem to be aware of myself as exerting causal influence, which often succeeds but may not. And since all of my intentional actions, any other action I do, consist in making a series of basic actions, I couldn't act at all unless I believed that I was exerting causal influence all the time. The idea of causation, which we get from our own experience, is an idea of one substance, a thing, in this case a person, me, bringing about some event, making something happen. It's not, as such, an idea of regular succession. But when we observe the regular successions in nature, we may use the idea we have already got from our own experience, we may use the idea to explain why those regular successions occur, understanding them in terms of inanimate substances having powers to cause certain kinds of effects and liability to exercise those powers under certain circumstances. We can explain the regularity that ignition of gunpowder is followed by an explosion by the gunpowder causing the explosion, causing in the sense we have already learnt of from our own experience, only the gunpowder causing the explosion, not intentionally, but because it has the liability to exercise its power to cause an explosion when ignited. Humans can choose how to exercise their powers, inanimate things can't. But once we realize that there can be singular causes as well as unobservable causes, singular causes because our exercise of causation is not an exercise of one event being followed by another, it's just an exercise of causation, and it doesn't imply anything about subsequent events. Once we realize that there can be singular causes as well as unobservable causes, it becomes evident that we need a wider account of the grounds for believing X to be the cause of Y, wider than that X is an A, Y is a B, and that we've observed in our experience A's followed by B's and all B's being preceded by A's. Or rather, we need a wider account of the grounds for attributing causes to those events which we do not ourselves intentionally cause. These normal grounds are that it follows from an explanatory hypothesis H, which is rendered probable by data, by the criteria described at the beginning of this lecture, that X is the cause of Y. These criteria will allow us to explain regular observable successions of events in terms of the powers and liabilities of observable substances, but they will also allow us to explain observable regularities in terms of the powers of unobservable substances. And they will also allow us to explain the data that all substances have similar powers and liabilities. The idea of causation, which we derive from our own experience, is as such neither one which is publicly observable, nor one which acts in a regular and predictable way. That means that the claim that there is an agent who causes the existence of all other substances with their powers and liabilities is an intelligible one, even though no similar agent does anything similar. And whether it is probable that there is such a cause is a matter of whether the hypothesis that there is such a cause satisfies the criteria set out earlier in this lecture. Hume's general principles about the limits to human understanding and knowledge had a great influence on Kant. And although it is Kant and not Hume who has had such a great influence on the philosophy of continental Europe, I have spent so much time discussing Hume because, as you will recognize, Kant inherited some of Hume's crucial bad mistakes. Kant did, of course, have a far more sophisticated philosophy than Hume's crude empiricism. To start with, Kant made the needed distinction between concept and object, in consequence of which his concept was no mere faint image. Kant tells us that the inputs to our mental life are, quote, intuitions, and that these are interpreted by concepts. Since, he claims, the only intuitions humans can have are sensible intuitions, the categories yield knowledge only insofar as they can be applied to such intuitions. I quote, "The categories as yielding knowledge of things have no kind of application, save only in regard to things which may be objects of possible experience." That, according to Kant, means sensible experience. However, unlike Hume, Kant allows that we can have concepts of objects outside possible experience. We can have, Kant allowed, concepts of an infinitely divisible substance, of noumena, and more particularly, the concept of a supreme being. So Kant seems to allow the logical possibility of singular causation. Nevertheless, we cannot, he held, reason about such objects, and so he adopted a modified form of Hume's view. Kant wrote, I quote, "If no intuition could be given corresponding to the concept, so far as I know, there could be nothing to which my thought could be applied. Hence, like Hume, Kant denied that we could have any knowledge of causes apart from one's connecting sensible phenomena in regular ways. Thus, I quote, "The principle of causality has no criterion for its application save only in the sensible world, since causation consists, I quote, in the succession of the manifold, so far as that succession is subject to a rule." So, Kant was arguing that we could have no ground for supposing that there are causes except those of repeatable, observable kinds, and hence the impossibility of natural theology. But, I have argued, there are obviously single causes, knowledge of which does not depend on influence from regular successions. So the crucial argument of both Hume and Kant seems to me deeply fallacious. Now Kant has much else, as Hume did, much else to say against natural theology, and I can't discuss it all, but I will just mention one further point. Kant has another crucial application hostile to natural theology of his principle that the categories as yielding knowledge of things have no kind of application save only in regard to things which may be objects of possible experience. And this is Kant's claim that since only the conditioned could be an object of possible experience, we can have no knowledge of the unconditioned, that is, the unlimited, such as the whole physical universe throughout space and time, and so we can have no knowledge of God, the supposed cause of all things, unconditioned in his power, knowledge, length of life, and so on. We can have no knowledge of things without limit of any kind, Kant is saying. Kant claimed to illustrate this claim by showing how various attempts to acquire knowledge of the unconditioned land us in irresoluble concepts, and the antinomies of pure reason purport to show that if we adduce an argument in favour of some position about the unconditioned, we find that there is an equally plausible argument in favour of the opposite position. More antinomies showing if you postulate an infinite x, then there's an equally plausible argument to show there isn't an infinite x, so you can't reach any conclusion about these matters. The arguments all appeal to purported rational principles, and they certainly show that either the principle invoked in the thesis or the principle invoked in the antithesis, or both, must be fallacious. But in my view, despite Kant, none of those principles are obvious necessary truths of reason, and evidence can often make one such principle more probable than another. And I can only take one simple example, but similar kinds of fallacies apply throughout the antinomies. Thus, the form of the thesis concerned with time in the first antinomy depends on the principle that, quote, the infinity of a series consists in the fact that it can never be completed through successive synthesis. So, you can never, there can't be an infinite series of which we have a last member, so we can't postulate that the universe is being infinite in time. The obvious response is that Kant has misstated the mathematical principle. The mathematical principle is that the infinity of a series with a first member consists in the fact that it can never be completed through successive synthesis. That is, if you have a thesis, a series starting with a first member 1, you can go on forever. But the series of events ending in the present state of the universe is not postulated by the person who says there's a beginningless universe as such a series, because it's not postulated as a series with a first member that has a last member. It's postulated as a series that has a last member but no first member, and so it's not relevant. The mathematical principle is that the infinity of a series with a first member consists in the fact that it can never be completed through successive synthesis. While that thesis is correct, it has no application to views about the beginning of the universe, because nobody is suggesting that the beginning of the universe is a series with no one who suggests that there's a beginningless universe is claiming that there's a series with a first member which has a last member. Well, that's a simple point. There are objections which I would be happy to discuss to any of the theses and antitheses that Kant puts forward in the Antinomies. But the failure of Kant's claims about the first antinomy should suffice to show that there is no general reason to suppose that there must always be equally plausible arguments in favour of rival claims about the unconditioned, and we only have any reason to acknowledge his principle that our categories must correspond to possible experience if we treat it as a principle about our fundamental categories. It provides no reason for denying the intelligibility of any particular combination of such categories, such as Hume acknowledged when he acknowledged that complex ideas formed of simple ideas can be meaningful, even if the complex ideas are not derived from complex expressions. And we can always define unconditioned series, unconditioned ideas, in terms of combinations of fundamental categories. A beginningless universe, for example, is one such that for each event in its history which has a beginning, there is an earlier event. The concepts of event, beginning, know, earlier, and so on, correspond to possible experiences. So we can talk about these things because we can define them in terms of things we can talk about. And so plausibly do the categories in terms of which God may be defined. Omnipotence, omniscience, perfect freedom, perfect goodness, and so on, can be defined by combinations of terms, each of which corresponds to a possible experience. An omnipotent being is, roughly, one who can do any action, the full description of which does not entail a contradiction. A perfectly good being is, roughly, one who does only good actions, the best possible action where there is a best possible action, one of a number of equal best action, if there is such. So we can define the terms we're talking about. There are patterns of argument relevant to them. And there are two fundamental problems lying behind Kant's arguments about all these issues. All the time, Kant was seeking necessary principles about the world. For example, every event has a cause. Necessary principles about the world on which he could base his metaphysics. But of course, as Joseph Butler wrote a few decades earlier, quote, to us, that is humans as opposed to God, to us, probability, not knowledge, is the very guide of life. And the second and connected problem for Kant is that he didn't have a very clear idea of what are the criteria for observed data making probable a theory about the unobservable, which I stated at the beginning of this lecture. There is a simple historical explanation of Kant's ignorance. Kant died in 1804. It was only in 1803 that the first version of an atomic theory of chemistry was proposed by Dalton, a theory which gave, by the criteria I expounded, a very probable explanation of the details of observed data, such as the fixed ratios by weight in which substances combine to fix new substances. Before Dalton, all theories about the unobservable were simply unevidenced speculations. Since Dalton, scientists have produced evidence making probable detailed theories, not merely about things too small, but about things too big, too old, and too strange to be observed. Kant had great respect for the physical sciences. If he had known of their subsequent history, he might have acknowledged great scope for human reason to acquire probably true beliefs about matters far beyond the observable, and so, given a correct account of causation, probably true beliefs about the ultimate cause of all finite things. So, I've explained to you my natural theology very briefly. I've explained to you why I think the arguments of Hume and Kant have no effect in suggesting that that is not a possible way of proceeding. And finally, and very briefly, what is the relevance of natural theology to the practice of religion? People come to believe that there is a God by different routes. Some people have strong religious experiences in which they seem to be strongly aware of the presence of God. And just as it is right to believe that we are perceiving some physical object when it seems to us strongly that we are perceiving it in the absence of counter-evidence, right to believe you're seeing a desk if you think you're seeing a desk in the absence of counter-evidence, so I suggest people are justified in believing there is a God without the need for positive arguments in the absence of counter-evidence. Other people come to believe there is a God on the basis of testimony. It's always right to trust what you're told by others in the absence of contrary testimony. And maybe in some remote villages in the Middle Ages, the only source of information about whether or not there was a God was the local priest. So if he told you there's a God, it became reasonable to believe this. But in the modern world, most people do not have strong enough religious experiences to believe that there's a God simply on the basis of those experiences. And most people who receive testimony that there is a God from some apparently well-informed person also hear testimony from some other apparently well-informed person that there is no God. In this situation, in order to hold a probably true belief that there is a God, we need cogent arguments. And the need for the arguments of natural theology is stronger in the modern world than it has been for many centuries. My book, The Existence of God, was concerned only with arguments for the existence of God, but there can also be arguments for what has been called a ramified natural theology. That is a theology that argues not merely for the existence of God, but for the particular doctrinal claims of some religion, as opposed to a bare natural theology. In my book, Faith and Reason, I sketch the kind of arguments which could establish the truth of a particular religious creedal system, such as that of the Christian religion, though I do not in that book discuss them in detail. But why does it matter whether we believe there's a God, let alone more doctrinal claims? Leading a worthwhile life involves fulfilling our obligations to others and doing good beyond obligation. Certain actions are obligatory anyway, whether or not there's a God. It's obligatory to feed and educate our children, whether or not there's a God. Some actions are good beyond obligation, whether or not there's a God. It's good to give quite a lot of money to feed the poor in distant lands, even if there is no God. But the existence and commands of God, if there is a God, make a great difference to which actions are obligatory and which actions are good. If there is a God, he has given us life and all the good things it contains. So it becomes obligatory to worship him, interact with him in prayer, ask his forgiveness for our wrongdoing, and seek to tell others about him. If there is no God, these activities are at best a waste of time. Further, we have an obligation to please our benefactors. If there is a God, he is our supreme benefactor. He has given us our lives and all the good things they contain. And so, if he commands us to use our life in a particular good way, it becomes not merely good, but obligatory to do so. And I suggest, while there is a limit to the extent of our obligations to worship God, there are good actions of worship and prayer which go beyond obligation, which would, of course, only be good if there is a God. So if we are to fulfill our obligations and lead a good life beyond obligation, we need to know whether or not there's a God. And if there is, we need to know what he has commanded us to do. If we have made a mess of our lives by not fulfilling our obligations to God, we need to know how to apologize to him and to know the conditions under which he might be prepared to forgive us. Also, if there is a God, he may have provided help to us to fulfill our obligations, and so, if so, we need to know how to obtain that help. And if he offers us a hope of a good life after death in interaction with him, it would be good to know this in order to encourage us to take steps to make ourselves fitted for that life. So for many reasons it would be good if we know whether or not there is a God. and if so, what he has commanded, how to obtain his forgiveness, and how to obtain his life, his help in living a better life in future, and to what such a better life might ultimately lead. I said it would be good to know these things, but certain knowledge is not possible in this life. So we have to make do with probably true beliefs, which is the best we have on which to rely in non-religious matters too. And so, if we have probably true beliefs about whether or not there's a God, and quite a lot of true beliefs about what he's like and wants us to do, of the kind provided by the detailed claims of a religion, that will enable us to see what would probably be a worthwhile life to live, and so provide help and encouragement to do so. So, the arguments of natural theology, ramified as well as bare, even if not fully convincing, can put someone in a position where it becomes rational to live their life on the assumption that there is a God who has done and said certain things. To do so is to believe in God, have faith in God, as opposed to merely believing that there is a God. And all of that is argued far more fully in my book, Faith and Reason. Thank you very much.